The Montana Territory had seen its share of gunslingers in the years following the Civil War. Men like Blackjack McGee, the infamous Carter brothers, and the notorious Quick Hand Thompson. But perhaps none left a more intriguing legacy than Michael Shadow Morgan, a man whose very presence would later make even the most hardened outlaws think twice about their choices. A quiet rancher whose lethal accuracy with a Colt Walker would send 19 men to their graves, who once simply stated, "I don't look for trouble, but trouble best look twice before finding me." Before we dive deeper into this remarkable tale, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story is something truly special that you won't want to miss. Eagles Crossing, Montana Territory, spring of 1876. The town was like many others taking root across the frontier, a dusty main street flanked by rough-hewn buildings where ambition and desperation danced an uneasy waltz beneath the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was the kind of place where folks learned to mind their own business, which is exactly why Michael Morgan chose it. He rode in on a crisp March morning, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. Those who witnessed his arrival would later recall two things: the distinctive Colt Walker revolver worn cross-draw style, unusual for a right-handed man, and his peculiar way of watching everything while seeming to look at nothing. Sheriff James Cooper, who'd worn his badge through 15 winters in Eagles Crossing, observed the newcomer from his usual post outside the jail. Some men, Cooper would later write in his daily log, carry their stories in their eyes. This one carried his like a weapon, held in check but ready to draw at a moment's notice. The town's residents were accustomed to strangers passing through, but something about Morgan was different. He moved with a fluid grace that some mistook for hesitation, but Cooper recognized it as the calm readiness of a mountain lion before the pounce. Doc William Henry was the first to actually speak with the mysterious arrival, treating a rope burn on his hand that Morgan claimed came from breaking horses. The doctor couldn't help but notice other marks that told a different story, the kind of scars that come from lead and steel rather than honest ranch work. But William Henry was a man who understood discretion, and the questions he didn't ask said as much as those he did. Within days, Morgan had purchased the old Thompson spread, 800 acres of prime grazing land that had been sitting empty since its previous owner relocated to Oregon. Martha Thompson, handling the sale for her brother, had turned down offers from both the Black Ridge Gang and several cattle barons who'd tried to pressure her into selling. There was something in the way he looked at the land, Martha would later tell Mary Cooper, the sheriff's wife, something that reminded me of how my brother used to watch over it, like a guardian, not just an owner. She wasn't wrong about Morgan's protective nature, though she couldn't have imagined just how far that instinct would eventually reach. The man settled into his new property with methodical precision, repairing fences, mending the barn roof, and starting a modest herd of cattle. He paid his bills promptly, attended church on Sundays, though he never joined in the hymns, and politely declined invitations to social gatherings. When spoken to, he responded with nods or the briefest of answers, earning him the local nickname, Silent Morgan. Mary Cooper, whose mercantile store served as the town's informal gathering place, noticed curious details about their new neighbor's habits: his preference for bulk ammunition purchases, his careful attention to wanted posters, and how he always positioned himself with a clear view of doors and windows. But there were other oddities that didn't escape notice. The way he seemed to materialize when trouble stirred in town. How his eyes constantly scanned the horizon during his infrequent supply runs. The fact that no one ever saw him without that distinctive Colt Walker, worn with the kind of familiarity that spoke of years of necessity rather than choice. Deputy Thomas Young Tom Wilson, eager to prove himself worthy of his badge, once claimed at the saloon that he'd seen Morgan practicing his draw in the early morning hours. "Never seen anything like it," he'd whispered, face pale from the memory. 6 shots, 6 targets, faster than a rattler's strike. But it wasn't the speed that gave me chills. It was how natural it looked, like breathing. The source of Morgan's shooting prowess might have remained a mystery, if not for the arrival of retired U.S. Marshal Calvin Burke that spring. The veteran lawman had tracked outlaws across 7 territories before hanging up his badge, and he was sharing coffee with Sheriff Cooper when Morgan walked past the jail. Burke's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, his weathered face turning ashen. "Good Lord above," he breathed. "I thought he was dead." Before Cooper could ask for clarification, fate intervened in the form of thundering hoofbeats. The Black Ridge Gang, 15 strong, had just ridden into Eagle's Crossing. Their reputation preceded them, a trail of robbed banks, burned ranches, and murdered lawmen stretching from Kansas to the Dakota Territory. With them came the storm that would shatter the silence surrounding Michael Shadow Morgan forever. The air grew thick with tension as the Black Ridge Gang dismounted, their spurs singing against the wooden sidewalks of Eagle's Crossing. The town had managed to stay relatively peaceful until now, thanks to Sheriff Cooper's steady hand and watchful eye. But everyone knew that was about to change. What they didn't know was that the quiet rancher watching from the shadows of Mary Cooper's store had been waiting for this moment all along. Sheriff James Cooper had seen enough trouble in his 15 years wearing the badge to know when a storm was brewing. As the Black Ridge Gang spread through Eagle's Crossing like poison in a well, he pulled the still-shaken Calvin Burke into his office, closing the door on the growing chaos outside. "All right, Calvin," Cooper said, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup. "You want to tell me what got you looking like you've seen a ghost out there?" He pulled up a chair, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. Years of experience had taught him that men like Burke didn't spook easily. Burke drained his cup in one swallow, his hands still trembling. "That's exactly what I saw, James. The ghost of Lost Valley." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That man you call Morgan, his real name is Michael Hawkins. 6 years ago, he was one of the most feared lawmen in the Kansas Territory." The revelation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Cooper had heard whispers of the Lost Valley Massacre. Every lawman had. A remote settlement destroyed by outlaws, 23 people killed, including a federal marshal's entire family. The only survivor was a young deputy who spent the next 2 years hunting down every last killer, earning the nickname Ghost for his ability to strike without being seen. "Stories say he died in 71, Burke continued. "Shot down in Oklahoma Territory, but looking at him just now." The old lawman shook his head. "A man learns to recognize eyes like that, James. Eyes that have seen too much death, caused too much of it. That's him sure as I'm sitting here." Cooper refilled their cups, buying time to process this information. "Tell me everything you know about him, Calvin. If we've got the ghost of Lost Valley in our town, I need to know what we're dealing with." Burke's weathered face grew distant with memory. "I crossed paths with him once, back in 70. Was tracking a killer named Frank Weber through Comanche country. Found Weber's camp one morning. What was left of it. Atkins had gotten there first. 3 men all taken down so quick they hadn't even cleared leather. No wasted shots, no signs of struggle. Just cold, precise work." Outside, the Black Ridge Gang was making their presence known. Luke Blackridge, the youngest brother, had already started trouble at the saloon, his drunken whoops mixing with the sound of breaking glass. Marcus Blackridge was methodically visiting each business along Main Street, making what he called friendly suggestions about protection payments. John Blackridge himself remained mounted on his paint stallion, watching the town with the calculating eyes of a predator sizing up its prey. His reputation for cruelty was well earned. He'd once burned down an entire settlement just to flush out one man who'd crossed him. The silver-trimmed spurs on his boots caught the afternoon sun as he shifted in his saddle, studying every detail of Eagle's Crossing like a general planning a siege. At Mary Cooper's store, the sheriff's wife found herself face-to-face with 2 of Blackridge's men. They were going through her inventory, helping themselves to whatever caught their fancy. One was tall and lean with a knife scar running down his cheek. The other was shorter but heavily muscled, wearing a cavalry hat pulled low over his eyes. "Boss wants to talk to you about your business arrangements," the tall one drawled, pushing merchandise off her shelves. The crash of breaking bottles punctuated his words. "Times are getting dangerous. Shame if something were to happen to this nice place." The bell above the door chimed softly. Michael Morgan stood in the doorway, his quiet presence somehow filling the entire room. He didn't speak, didn't reach for his gun, just stood there with those haunted eyes that Burke had recognized. The thin mountain sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver streaks in his dark hair, remnants of whatever horrors had turned a young deputy into the ghost of legend. "This ain't your concern, friend," the taller outlaw said, his hand drifting toward his holster. "Best move along before things get unfriendly." Before we continue this tale that took countless hours to research and write, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. It means the world to us. Now, back to our story. Morgan didn't move. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the store. "The lady doesn't need any new arrangements." There was something different about his voice now, an edge of steel beneath the quiet tone, like the whisper of a blade being drawn. The outlaws exchanged glances, sizing up the situation. They'd been told the town was soft, easy pickings. The silent rancher in the doorway didn't fit that description. Something in his stance, the way he held himself perfectly still, sent warning signals through their trail-hardened instincts. "Maybe you didn't hear about the Blackridge gang," the shorter outlaw said, taking a step forward. His hand was twitching near his gun, but he hadn't committed to the draw. "We've killed men for less than—" "I heard," Morgan interrupted, still eerily calm. "Killed those farmers near Fort Smith, burned down their barn, shot the horses first to make sure they couldn't escape." His eyes never left them as he spoke, and in their depths Mary Cooper saw something that chilled her more than the outlaw's threats, a cold, calculating fury held in check by iron will. "That was you boys, wasn't it?" The way he said it sent chills down Mary's spine. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. A promise. The outlaws' bravado faltered. They'd bullied plenty of townspeople before, but this was different. This was like standing in front of a coiled rattlesnake, knowing the strike was coming, but not knowing when. "We'll let the boss know you need some convincing," the taller one muttered, and they backed out of the store, trying to maintain their dignity while their instincts screamed at them to run. Outside, John Blackridge had noticed the exchange. He sat straighter in his saddle, studying the quiet rancher with newfound interest. Something about the man's bearing caught his attention, a familiar hint of danger that he'd learned never to ignore. "Marcus," he called to his brother, "send a couple boys out to that Thompson spread tonight. Let's see what our friend's made of." A cruel smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Been a while since we had any real sport in these parts." Back in the sheriff's office, Burke was still piecing together the story for Cooper. After Lost Valley, Hawkins became something else entirely. Not just a lawman seeking justice, he was vengeance itself. They say he could track a man across bare rock and appear like a spirit in the night. Never used torture, never dragged it out. Just cold, methodical justice. "And you're certain it's him?" Cooper asked, watching through the window as Morgan crossed the street, his dark duster rippling in the mountain wind. "Look at how he moves," Burke replied. "That's a man who's danced with death so many times they know each other's steps by heart. And if I'm right, James, this town's about to see what happens when the ghost decides to haunt the living again." At his ranch, Morgan methodically cleaned his Colt Walker revolver, each movement precise and practiced. The weapon had been with him since Lost Valley, its wooden grip worn smooth by years of use. He'd added a second gun to his arsenal since then, a Remington 1858 conversion worn high on his right hip, both weapons as much a part of him as his own hands. The sun was setting over Eagle's Crossing, painting the sky in shades of blood red as darkness crept in. The townspeople hurried to their homes, locking doors and windows. They could feel it in their bones. Violence was coming to their quiet town. The peace they'd known was about to be shattered by the collision of old ghosts and new demons. And in the growing darkness, Michael Morgan rode toward his ranch, the weight of his past settling around his shoulders like his old duster. The mountain darkness fell thick and heavy over Eagle's Crossing, broken only by scattered patches of starlight and a waning moon hanging low on the horizon. At the Thompson spread, now Morgan's property, oil lamps burned in the windows of the old two-story house, casting long shadows across the yard where two horses stood saddled and ready. Inside, Morgan continued his methodical cleaning of his weapons, each movement deliberate and purposeful. The familiar routine reminded him of other nights, other battles, back when he wore a badge and believed in the letter of the law. Before, Lost Valley taught him that some justice needs to be delivered from the shadows. The sound came just after midnight, the distant crack of a breaking branch followed by the nervous whinny of his horses. Morgan extinguished the lamps with practiced efficiency, moving through the darkness like he'd been born to it. From his window, he could make out 4 riders approaching through their ease, trying to use the woodland's edge for cover. They were good, he had to give them that. Moving in pairs, keeping to the shadows, spreading out to cover all approaches to the house. But good wasn't enough when you were hunting a ghost. Down in Eagles Crossing, Sheriff Cooper sat in his office with Calvin Burke, neither man even pretending to sleep. "Have you ever seen him work?" Cooper asked, breaking the long silence. Burke nodded slowly. "Once. Remember that business with the Carson boys up in Wyoming? 3 of them had a homesteader's family pinned down in their cabin. Hawkins came out of a snowstorm like Judgment Day itself. Never seen anything like it. 3 shots, 3 bodies, all before they even knew he was there. And now we've got him and the Blackridge gang in the same valley," Cooper mused. "Lord help us all." Back at the ranch, the first of John Blackridge's men was already learning why they called him Ghost. The outlaw never even saw Morgan, just felt the cold press of steel against his neck and heard that whispered voice. "Drop the gun. Slow and easy." His partner, 20 feet away, disappeared into the shadows with a muffled grunt. The night seemed to swallow him whole. "How many riders at the main camp?" Morgan asked, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Go to hell," the outlaw spat. "Been there," Morgan replied. "Lost Valley, 6 years ago. Now answer the question." Something in his tone made the outlaw's blood run cold. 15, maybe 20. John's got men coming in from... He never finished the sentence. Morgan's gun stock connected with precise force and the man crumpled silently to the ground. Inside the house, the remaining 2 outlaws were discovering that entering a ghost's lair was poor strategy. They'd managed to pick the back door's lock only to find the ground floor empty, the furniture arranged to create an elaborate maze of shadows and blind corners. "Check upstairs," the leader whispered to his partner. "I'll clear down here." They never saw each other again. The first man made it halfway up the stairs before a floorboard creaked behind him. He spun, gun clearing leather, but the shadow that moved past him was faster. A hand clamped over his mouth, while another trapped his gun hand. The struggle was brief and silent. His partner, searching the kitchen, heard nothing. The moonlight cast strange shadows through the windows, making every corner seem alive with movement. He was a veteran of a dozen raids, but something about this place set his nerves on edge. The silence felt wrong, heavy with menace. A whisper came from everywhere and nowhere. "The farmers at Fort Smith, the ones you burned alive. Did they beg?" The outlaw spun, firing blindly into the shadows. His muzzle flash destroyed his night vision. His last mistake. When they found him the next morning, his gun was still smoking, empty shells scattered across the floor. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, John Blackridge heard horses approaching their camp. He recognized the sound of Buck's distinctive gait, but something was wrong. The big roan was moving too slow, and there was an extra set of hoofbeats carrying an ominous message. Luke Blackridge, half drunk by the campfire, was the first to spot them. "That ain't right," he muttered, reaching for his gun. 2 horses emerged from the darkness. Buck, their best scout's mount, was leading another horse, and tied across both saddles were the 4 men they'd sent to Morgan's ranch. All were unconscious but alive, each disabled with surgical precision. A note was pinned to the lead rider's shirt. "Next time send better men or come yourself." John Blackridge crushed the note in his fist, his face twisted with rage. "Marcus," he called to his brother, "get some men into town. I want to know everything about this rancher. Where he came from, what he's running from, everything." "Already done," Marcus replied, emerging from the shadows. Sent Jim and Carl to ask around. They should be back by morning. But morning would bring its own revelations. Calvin Burke was already riding out of town, heading east. He'd seen what was coming, and he knew where he needed to go. There were other ghosts out there, other legends from the Lost Valley days, and Eagle's Crossing would need every one of them before this was over. In town, Mary Cooper opened her store to find a small package on the counter, though all her doors and windows were still locked. Inside was a box of ammunition for the shotgun she kept under the counter, and a simple note: "Stay ready." At his ranch, Morgan watched the sunrise from his porch, counting the hours until the real violence would begin. The 4 men he'd sent back were just a message, a reminder that some predators are best left undisturbed. But he knew John Blackridge's type. The message wouldn't be enough. The morning brought more than just sunlight to Eagle's Crossing. It brought whispers. Word of the night's events at the Thompson spread moved through town like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. By noon, half the town claimed Morgan had single-handedly fought off a dozen men, while the other half swore it was closer to 20. Doc William Henry's office had become an impromptu gathering place as he treated the 4 returned raiders. None had life-threatening injuries, but each bore the precise brutality of their encounter. Dislocated shoulders, cracked ribs, carefully placed bruises. The kind of damage that spoke of calculated violence rather than blind rage. "Never saw him coming," one of them muttered through swollen lips. "Just this whisper in the dark, then nothing." The others nodded in agreement, their eyes haunted by more than just physical pain. Marcus Blackridge stood in the corner of the doctor's office, his cold eyes taking in every detail. Unlike his brothers, Marcus had learned to read men like books, and these injuries told a story he didn't like. Each blow had been precisely placed, designed to incapacitate without killing. This wasn't the work of some lucky rancher. This was professional violence. "Tell me again," he pressed. "Exactly what happened when you entered the house." The oldest of the 4, a scarred veteran named Tucker, shook his head. "It was like trying to fight a shadow, Mr. Blackridge. The place was rigged. Furniture moved to create blind spots, rugs pulled back to make the floorboards creak. He knew exactly where we'd go, how we'd move. Turned the whole house into a trap." At the saloon, Luke Blackridge was drowning his frustration in whiskey, his anger growing with each drink. "Should have burned the whole damn place down," he growled to no one in particular. "That's what John would have done in the old days." A quiet voice behind him made him freeze. "Your brother's smarter than that." Luke turned to find Morgan standing at the bar, calmly pouring himself a drink. The saloon fell silent, the piano player's fingers hovering motionlessly above the keys. "Got some nerve showing your face in town," Luke snarled, his hand inching toward his gun. Morgan sipped his whiskey, seemingly unconcerned. "Just here for supplies, unless you'd rather continue last night's discussion." The tension in the saloon was unbearable. Everyone had heard about the night raid by now, and they watched the exchange with a mixture of fear and fascination. Luke Blackridge's reputation with a gun was well known, but there was something about Morgan's calm demeanor that made even hardened men nervous. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Morgan asked softly. "Your brother John's the thinker. You've always been more impulsive." Luke's face twisted with rage. "How do you—" "I know all about the Blackridge gang," Morgan interrupted. "The bank in Dodge City, the massacre at Fort Collins, the bounties on your heads that keep growing. I even know about that business at Fort Smith, the part that didn't make the wanted posters." Luke's hand had almost reached his gun when a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, little brother." John Blackridge stood in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. He walked into the saloon with the confident stride of a man used to owning any room he entered. "Mr. Morgan and I need to have a private conversation." Your men need better training, Morgan remarked, still not turning around. They make too much noise in the dark. A ghost of a smile played across John's features. Seems to me you know a lot about moving in the dark. Almost like you've had practice. He pulled up a bar stool, keeping a careful distance. I've been asking around about you. Interesting thing, nobody seems to know where you came from. Just appeared one day like a ghost. The word hung in the air between them. In the street outside, Marcus Blackridge was positioning men at strategic points, covering every exit. Inside, Luke's trigger finger twitched with barely contained violence. Ghosts don't bleed, Morgan replied quietly. Everyone bleeds, John countered. Even legends. Even the famous Ghost of Lost Valley. The name dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Around the saloon, men who'd heard the stories found themselves instinctively backing away. The Ghost of Lost Valley was more than just a legend. He was a nightmare that still haunted men's dreams. That ghost died in Oklahoma, Morgan said, finally turning to face John. Their eyes met across the smoky room, two predators taking each other's measure. Did he? John's smile widened. Because I heard a story once about a lawman who lost everything at a place called Lost Valley. Lost his family, his badge, everything but his guns and his skill with them. They say he spent 2 years hunting down every last man responsible. 19 kills, all of them clean, professional. No witnesses, no warnings, just bodies left in the dark. Morgan's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, a cold light that made even John Blackridge pause. Stay away from my ranch, Morgan said softly. Stay away from this town. You've got 2 days to ride out. Take your business elsewhere. John laughed, but there was no humor in it. Or what? You'll add us to your count. Morgan turned back to his drink. I'll add you to my ghosts. The threat hung in the air as Morgan finished his whiskey and walked out of the saloon, past Luke's trembling gun hand and through the gauntlet of Blackridge's men. Each of them found themselves avoiding his gaze, their hands strangely reluctant to stray too close to their weapons. As the saloon doors swung shut behind him, John Blackridge's smile faded. Marcus, he called to his brother, send word to all our friends in the territory. I want every gun we can hire. If he wants to play ghost, we'll give him a proper haunting. The war for Eagle's Crossing was about to begin, and the Ghost of Lost Valley had just thrown down the gauntlet. But as Morgan rode back to his ranch, old memories stirred like dust in the wind. The Blackridges didn't know it yet, but they'd just made the same mistake as the killers at Lost Valley. They'd mistaken his quiet nature for weakness, not realizing that the deadliest predators are the ones you never hear coming. Word travels fast in the territories, carried on horseback and whispered in saloons. Within 24 hours of John Blackridge's call, gunmen began arriving in Eagle's Crossing, hardened killers drawn by the promise of blood money and the chance to test themselves against a legend. By sunset, the town had gained 20 new faces, each one carrying steel on their hip and murder in their hearts. At the sheriff's office, James Cooper watched them filter in with growing unease. These weren't common outlaws, these were professional killers. He recognized more than a few faces from wanted posters. Three Finger, Jack Wilson from Kansas, the notorious Santiago brothers out of New Mexico, even the infamous Pete Quick Kill Murphy from Colorado territory. They're building an army, young Tom Wilson observed, his young face tight with worry. Not an army, Cooper corrected grimly. A hunting party. But Calvin Burke had been busy too. His urgent telegram had reached its destination, a remote ranch in Wyoming where other ghosts from the past had found their own kind of peace. The message was simple. The ghost rides again. Eagle's Crossing. Come quick. Back at his ranch, Morgan was making preparations of his own. Those who rode past reported seeing him methodically working on his property, repairing fences, tending cattle, seemingly unconcerned with the gathering storm. But closer observation would have revealed subtle changes, sightlines being cleared, approaches to the house being modified, ammunition being strategically placed. Mary Cooper noticed something else when Morgan came in for supplies. Extra coffee, bacon, and ammunition, enough for several men. "Expecting company?" she asked carefully. "Old friends," he replied softly, his eyes distant. In town, Marcus Blackridge was orchestrating their strategy with cold precision. He'd divided their forces into teams, each assigned to specific approaches to Morgan's ranch. "He's one man," Marcus told his brother John. "No matter how good he is, he can't watch every direction at once." John nodded, studying the crude map they'd drawn of the property. "What about the town?" "Most folks'll stay out of it," Marcus replied. "Sheriff Cooper's got no deputies to speak of except that green kid Wilson. Even if he wanted to interfere, he couldn't." Luke Blackridge, nursing both a hangover and his wounded pride from the saloon encounter, spat on the floor. "Should have killed him yesterday when we had the chance." "And miss all the fun?" John smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No, little brother. When we take down the ghost of Lost Valley, I want it done right. I want stories told about it." As evening approached, Doc William Henry was surprised by a visitor. Morgan, carrying a leather medical bag. "Belonged to the doctor at Lost Valley," Morgan explained quietly. "I've carried it ever since. Thought you might need it soon." The doctor examined the bag's contents. Surgical instruments, bandages, and medicines all meticulously maintained. "You're expecting casualties?" "I'm expecting war," Morgan replied. "Best be prepared." The doctor studied his patient-turned-warrior carefully. "The men they're bringing in, they're not common thugs." "No," Morgan agreed. "They're professionals, killers, men who've made their living by the gun." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "But they've never hunted a ghost before." At the saloon, the newly arrived gunmen were getting restless. They'd heard the stories about the ghost of Lost Valley, but many dismissed them as tall tales. Santiago Martinez, his dark eyes glittering with amusement, entertained the crowd with his own theory. "I heard he died in Oklahoma," the Mexican gunfighter declared, "shot in the back by a woman he wronged." These stories about him hunting men in the dark, cuentos de hadas, fairy tales to scare children and fool gringos. "Tell that to the 4 men he sent back last night," someone muttered. Martinez laughed. 4 common bandidos surprised in the dark. Tomorrow we will see how this ghost fares against real killers. But not everyone shared his confidence. Pete Murphy, a veteran gunfighter with 13 notches on his ivory-handled Colts, sat quietly in the corner, watching and listening. He'd crossed paths with the ghost once, years ago in Kansas Territory, had seen firsthand what happened to men who underestimated him. The memories still gave him nightmares. As night fell, Martha Thompson made her way to Morgan's ranch despite the dangers. The old widow found him on his porch watching the sunset with those haunted eyes that had seen too much death. "My brother," she said without preamble. "Before he left for Oregon, he kept a cache of weapons. Civil War supplies hidden in a cave up in the hills. Never told anyone but me about it." She paused, studying Morgan carefully. "Army rifles, ammunition, even a small cannon, if I remember right." Morgan studied her carefully. "Why tell me now?" "Because I know what's coming," she replied, her voice steady despite her age. "And whatever else you are, Mr. Morgan, or whatever name you're really using, you're a good man. My brother would have wanted you to have them." Later that night, Sheriff Cooper made his own visit to the ranch. He found Morgan cleaning his guns by lamplight, each movement precise and practiced. "I can't help you officially," Cooper said. "Too many of them, and the law's stretched thin out here." "I know. But I can tell you they're planning to move at dawn. Marcus Blackridge has them organized in teams. They'll come from all directions, trying to overwhelm you with numbers." Morgan nodded, never looking up from his work. "You should get your deputy out of town tomorrow. Take him on patrol somewhere far from here." Already planned to, Cooper replied. God help us all, Morgan. Or whatever name you're really using. As the sheriff rode away, other figures were moving in the darkness. Calvin Burke's message had reached its mark, and old debts were about to be paid. The ghost of Lost Valley wouldn't face tomorrow's storm alone. In town, John Blackridge gathered his killers for final instructions. Tomorrow we end the legend of the ghost, he declared, his voice carrying across the crowded saloon. $500 to the man who brings me proof of his death. Double that if you take him alive. But as they plotted and planned, none of them noticed the strange lights up in the hills behind Morgan's ranch, or the shadowy figures moving through the night, drawn by an old oath and the call of vengeance long delayed. Sarah Mitchell, who'd lost her husband to outlaws years ago, found herself preparing bandages in Doc Henry's office. I remember the stories, she told the doctor quietly, about the ghost of Lost Valley. They say he never killed without giving his targets a chance to leave, to change their ways. But once they chose violence, he became the consequence of that choice, Doc Henry finished. He'd been studying the medical bag Morgan had given him, noting the precise organization, the careful maintenance. This isn't the work of a simple killer. Everything he does has purpose, preparation. Outside, the town itself seemed to be holding its breath. People hurried through their evening tasks, locking doors and windows earlier than usual. The saloon was packed with Blackridge's hired guns, their boasts and laughter carrying an edge of nervous energy. Pete Murphy, still nursing his whiskey in the corner, finally spoke up. "You boys think you're hunting him," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "But I was there 3 years ago, when he came for the Carson gang. Watched from half a mile away as he took down 6 men. Didn't even hear the shots. Just saw them fall, one after another, like God himself had called their numbers." "You're drunk, old man," Martinez scoffed, but others noticed how his hand tightened on his gun belt. "Maybe so," Murphy agreed. "But come dawn, we'll see who's been hunting who." Up at the ranch, Morgan stood at his window, watching the distant lights of Eagles Crossing. The town had given him something he thought he'd lost forever at Lost Valley, a home worth protecting. He checked his guns one final time, then moved through the house, making last-minute adjustments to his preparations. In the hills above, shadows moved against shadows. Horses picked their way carefully along hidden trails, guided by riders who knew the value of silence. The stage was set. Come dawn, Eagles Crossing would become a battlefield, and the legend of the ghost would either end or grow even larger in the telling. Dawn came to Eagles Crossing like a held breath, the morning mist clinging to the ground in ghostly tendrils. The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern mountains when John Blackridge's army of killers began moving into position. They spread out in a wide circle around Morgan's ranch, their movements precise and coordinated under Marcus's careful planning. Santiago Martinez led the first team approaching from the south, his dark serape blending with the pre-dawn shadows. The Santiago brothers took the eastern approach while Pete Murphy's group, under threat of death from John Blackridge, crept in from the west. Marcus Blackridge himself commanded the northern team, with John holding 10 men in reserve, ready to strike wherever an opportunity presented itself. But something was wrong. Murphy felt it first, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the instinct that had kept him alive through countless gunfights. The ranch was too quiet. No movement, no smoke from the chimney, not even a dog's bark. "Hold up," he whispered to his men. "Something ain't right." Before anyone could respond, a voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carrying on the morning wind. "Last chance to ride away." It was Morgan's voice, but it seemed to come from multiple directions, making it impossible to pinpoint. Several of the hired guns jumped, their nerves already frayed. "Show yourself, ghost," Martinez shouted from his position. "Or are you only brave in the dark?" The answer came in the form of a single gunshot. One of Martinez's men pitched forward, clutching his shoulder, wounded, but alive. A warning shot. "That's one," Morgan's voice drifted through the mist. "I won't aim to wound twice." John Blackridge's voice cut through the tension. "Take him." The valley erupted in gunfire. Bullets whined through the morning air, chewing splinters from the ranch house and surrounding buildings, but return fire came from unexpected quarters, the barn, the corral, positions that shouldn't have been defendable by one man. "He's not alone," Marcus shouted. "Watch the high ground." He was right. Figures had appeared on the ridge line above the ranch. 5 riders, their long coats marking them as cut from the same cloth as Morgan. Calvin Burke's message had found its mark. "Who the hell are they?" Luke Blackridge demanded, watching through his spyglass from the reserve position. John's face had gone pale. "The other ghosts," he whispered. "The ones who rode with him after Lost Valley." The battle devolved into chaos. The Santiago brothers team tried to rush the barn only to be caught in devastating crossfire. 3 men fell before they could reach cover. Martinez's group made it to the corral but found themselves pinned down by precise fire from multiple directions. Pete Murphy had seen enough. "Fall back," he shouted to his men. "It's a killing ground." But retreat wasn't as simple as advancing had been. Every route of escape seemed covered. Every movement drew fire. The ghost of Lost Valley had turned his entire ranch into an elaborate trap, using the terrain and pre-positioned defenses to maximum effect. Marcus Blackridge watched his careful plan unravel through gritted teeth. "Push forward!" he commanded. "We still have the numbers?" A quiet voice behind him made his blood run cold. "Numbers don't matter in the dark, Marcus." He spun, drawing his gun, but Morgan was faster. Marcus found himself staring down the barrel of that legendary Colt Walker, his own gun clattering to the ground. 6 years, Morgan said softly. "I've waited to meet you. You were there at Lost Valley. Gave the orders that night." Marcus's eyes widened with recognition. "We thought you were dead." "I was," Morgan replied. "What you're fighting now is just the ghost." Up on the ridge, the 5 riders began moving down toward the battle. Their leader, a graying man with a face weathered by years of violence, raised his hand. The others spread out, each taking prearranged positions. John Blackridge, watching the disaster unfold, made his decision. John Blackridge, watching his carefully laid plans crumble, barked orders to his reserves. "Luke, get our men up there, surround the house." But Luke Blackridge never got the chance to relay that order. A bullet kicked up dust at his feet, followed by that now familiar whisper in the wind. "The boy stays out of it." Down in Eagles Crossing, townsfolk watched from behind locked doors as some of Blackridge's men came stumbling back into town, faces pale with fear. Doc Henry was already preparing his office, laying out surgical instruments from Morgan's medical bag. He knew it would be a long day. At the ranch, Santiago Martinez had lost his earlier bravado. Pinned down behind the corral, he tried to rally his remaining men. "Es solo un hombre. One man cannot." The words died in his throat as Morgan stepped out of the shadows behind his position. The legendary gunman moved like smoke, his black duster making him seem part of the darkness itself. 2 of Martinez's men reached for their guns. Both were on the ground before their hands found steel. "You asked to see the ghost," Morgan said quietly. "Here I am." Up at the main house, John Blackridge was finally beginning to understand the true gravity of his mistake. He'd brought an army to kill a legend, only to find that legends sometimes travel in packs. The 5 riders from the ridge were now moving systematically through his men, each displaying the same deadly efficiency as Morgan himself. Pete Murphy, perhaps the only one among them who had truly understood what they were facing, threw down his gun belt. "I'm done," he announced. "Any man with sense would be—" The morning was not yet half over, and already the legend of the ghost of Lost Valley was growing. The 5 riders who'd come to Morgan's aid were revealed to be men with their own dark histories, former lawmen who'd lost everything to violence and found a new purpose in delivering justice from the shadows. "Wasn't going to let you face this alone," the lead rider, former Marshal Alan Kane, told Morgan. "Not after Lost Valley. We all came, every one of us who rode with you back then." The other riders were spreading out, each taking strategic positions. They moved with the coordinated precision of men who'd fought together before, who'd learned to trust each other with their lives. In town, John Blackridge was regrouping his remaining forces. More than half his men were dead, wounded, or had simply fled after witnessing the morning's carnage. Marcus had disappeared, and Luke was growing increasingly unstable, his fear masked by false bravado and whiskey. "Send word to every camp and hideout within riding distance," John ordered one of his men. "Promise them whatever they want. I need more guns here by nightfall." "They won't come," Pete Murphy said, walking into the saloon, his gun belt still conspicuously absent. "Word's already spreading about what happened this morning. No one's going to ride against the Judgment Riders, not for any price." John's face twisted with rage. "They're just men." "No," Murphy replied, pouring himself a drink with trembling hands. "There's something else out there, something that should have stayed buried in the past." At the sheriff's office, James Cooper was getting the full story from Calvin Burke. "After Lost Valley," the old lawman explained, "Morgan didn't just hunt killers. He found others like him, lawmen who'd lost everything to violence. Kane lost his family to outlaws in Colorado. Matthews watched raiders murder everyone in his town. Thompson's entire family was slaughtered by bandits." "And they all rode together?" Cooper asked. "For 2 years," Burke nodded. "They weren't vigilantes. They worked within the law when they could. But when the law failed," his voice trailed off. "They called them the Judgment Riders, 6 men who'd seen too much darkness and decided to fight it on its own terms." Back at the ranch, Morgan conferred with his old companions, checking weapons and preparing for the final confrontation. Each man carried his own ghosts, his own reasons for being there. "Blackridge won't go down easy," Kane observed, his voice gruff with experience. "No," Morgan agreed, his voice barely a whisper. "But he'll go down." The sun was past its zenith now, the afternoon shadows beginning to lengthen across Eagle's Crossing. Civilians were being evacuated, leaving the streets eerily empty. Everyone could feel it, the calm before the final storm, the moment when legends either die or are born. The Ghost of Lost Valley was about to write his final chapter, and he'd brought an army of ghosts to help him do it. John Blackridge had gathered his remaining men, barely 15 of the original force, in several buildings along Main Street. The Judgment Riders had taken up positions on the outskirts, while Morgan moved like a shadow through the empty streets. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Inside the saloon, John Blackridge was reaching the dangerous calm that came with desperation. "Marcus," he called to his brother, who'd finally reappeared, looking shaken. "Take 8 men through the back alleys. Get to the livery stable. We'll need fresh horses." But Marcus Blackridge, always the strategist, saw through his brother's plan. "You're not thinking of trying to break out? They've got every road covered." "Better than dying in this tomb," Luke snarled, his eyes wild with fear and whiskey. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was rolling in from the mountains, dark clouds gathering like spectators to the coming violence. Morgan stood in the shadows of Mary Cooper's store, watching the saloon with predatory patience. Marshal Kane appeared beside him, moving as silently as his former student. "Thompson's in position at the church tower," Kane reported. "Matthews has the back alleys covered. No one's slipping out this time." Morgan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "And the civilians?" "Doc Henry's got most of them in the basement of his office. Sarah and Martha insisted on staying to help with the wounded." A wry smile crossed Morgan's face. Brave women. Brave town. Inside the saloon, John was growing increasingly agitated as his options dwindled. Through the windows, he could see the storm clouds gathering, promising darkness well before sunset. "We wait for the rain," he decided. "Use the cover to break for the horses. Split up, ride in different directions. They can't catch us all." "They won't have to," Marcus replied grimly. "They'll just follow whoever's trailing blood. That's how he worked after Lost Valley. Wounded one followed him to the others." Luke's hand tightened on his bottle. "How do you know so much about it?" Marcus's face went dark. "Because I was there that night. Helped plan the raid. watched them burn the marshal's house with his family inside. His voice trailed off as the implications of his words sank in. All except his young deputy. John's eyes widened. The deputy? Morgan was the deputy. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as Marcus nodded. We thought he died in the fire. By the time we realized he'd survived, he'd already started hunting us. 2 years he spent tracking down everyone who was there that night, everyone except us, John finished, because we'd already made a name for ourselves. Too many men, too well protected. Until now. Thunder cracked overhead as the storm broke in earnest, rain drumming on the roof of the saloon, and lightning flashing across the darkening sky. In that brief illumination, John caught a glimpse of movement outside, figures taking up new positions in the gloom. "Now!" he shouted. "Everyone move!" The Blackridge gang burst from their hideouts like startled rabbits, running for the livery stable through the curtain of rain. Gunfire erupted immediately, the muzzle flashes bright in the artificial twilight. Men fell, their blood mixing with rainwater in the muddy street. Marcus led his group through the back alleys, only to find Matthews waiting for them, the former lawman's Winchester speaking 3 times, dropping 3 men in their tracks. The rest scattered, trying to find cover in the rain and darkness. Luke Blackridge, drunk and terrified, broke away from the main group, running blindly through the storm. He made it as far as the church before a quiet voice stopped him. "That's far enough, boy." Luke turned to find Morgan standing there, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. The youngest Blackridge drew his gun with desperate speed, but he never had a chance. The ghost's Colt Walker seemed to materialize in his hand, and Luke Blackridge fell face first into the mud. John and Marcus, along with their remaining men, managed to reach the livery stable. They began saddling horses with frantic haste, knowing every second brought death closer. "We can still make it," John insisted, his voice rising to be heard over the storm. "Split up, every man for himself, head for—" "No one's leaving," the voice came from the shadows. Morgan stepped into view, followed by Marshal Kane and the other judgment riders. Lightning flashed, illuminating them like avenging angels. 6 years, Morgan said quietly. 6 years I've waited for this moment. Watched you hurt people, burn homes, destroy lives, just like you did at Lost Valley. Marcus raised his hand slowly. "We can talk about this. Make a deal." "We're past deals," Kane growled. "Past mercy, past everything except judgment." John Blackridge, knowing it was over, went for his gun with all the speed that had made him famous. For a moment the stable was filled with thunder, both from the sky and from multiple revolvers. When the echoes died, John Blackridge lay dead in the straw, his final expression one of disbelief. Marcus made no move for his weapon. He simply stood there, rain dripping from his clothes as Morgan approached. "Do it quickly," he said quietly. "I was there that night. I deserve it." Morgan studied him for a long moment. "Yes," he finally replied. "You do." The Colt Walker roared one final time, and the last of the Blackridge gang fell. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass. Sheriff Cooper and Doc Henry were already moving through the streets, gathering up survivors and securing prisoners. The civilians emerged from their shelters, blinking in the renewed sunlight like people waking from a nightmare. The judgment riders gathered one last time in front of the livery stable, their work done, their old debts finally paid. Marshal Kane turned to Morgan, who was watching the town slowly come back to life. "What will you do now?" the old lawman asked. Morgan looked at his ranch in the distance, then at the town he'd helped liberate. "Think I might stay," he said softly. "Someone needs to keep the peace." The ghost became a guardian. Kane smiled. "Fitting." Sarah Mitchell found Morgan later that evening, as he was helping Doc Henry with the wounded. "Those men who came to help you," she said carefully. "Will there be others like the Blackridges coming to test themselves against your legend?" "Always," Morgan replied, his voice still quiet but somehow different now, less haunted. "But they'll find more than a ghost waiting for them here." The legend of the ghost of Lost Valley had come full circle. What began with a lone avenger haunted by past tragedies had become a story of redemption, not just for one man, but for an entire community. As the sun set over Eagle's Crossing, people spoke not just of the quiet rancher who protected them, but of the town itself, a place where good people had learned to stand against evil, where a ghost had taught them not to fear the dark. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but in one corner of the territories, the darkness had learned to fear those it meant to prey upon. And in the end, that was a legend, worth more than all the others combined. Martha Thompson, watching Morgan ride back to his ranch in the fading light, smiled to herself. "My brother would be proud," she told Mary Cooper. "He always said this land needed a guardian, though I doubt he ever imagined it would be a ghost." A week after what would become known as the Eagles Crossing shootout, the town was still counting its costs. 23 men had fallen, including the Blackridge brothers, with twice that many nursing wounds in Doc Henry's makeshift hospital. The final tally told a story of violence that would be whispered about in saloons across the territory for years to come. Sheriff James Cooper stood in his office, staring at the stack of reports on his desk. The territorial governor would want details, and the bounties on the Blackridge gang alone would keep the clerks busy for months. Calvin Burke sat across from him, helping to sort through the aftermath of justice. "Interesting thing about the wounds," Cooper mused, reviewing Doc Henry's notes. "Most of the survivors were hit in the shoulders or legs. Even in the thick of it, Morgan and his men were choosing their shots." Burke nodded. "That's how they worked after Lost Valley, too. Clean kills for the worst ones. Wounds for those who might learn from a second chance." He shuffled through some papers. "Remember that young gun who rode with Blackridge's bunch? The kid from Kansas? Found him helping at the church yesterday, said he's looking for honest work now." "Sometimes mercy teaches better lessons than violence," Cooper replied thoughtfully. Young Tom Wilson had spent the morning collecting statements from witnesses, each account adding new layers to the legend. "Some swear they saw Morgan in 2 places at once during the fight," he reported. "Others say bullets couldn't touch him, just passed right through like he really was a ghost." "Let them talk," Cooper replied. "Sometimes a legend protects better than a law book." In town, life was slowly returning to normal, though changes were evident everywhere. Mary Cooper had reopened her store, though customers noticed she kept a shotgun closer now. Martha Thompson had taken to bringing food to the wounded, even those who'd ridden with Blackridge. "Hate the sin, not the sinner," she'd say, though she never lingered long near the survivors. Pete Murphy, who'd survived by surrendering early, had found an unexpected purpose helping Doc Henry care for the wounded. His gunfighter's hands proved steady with bandages and medicine, and more than one man owed his life to Murphy's care. "Never thought I'd end up on this side of things," he told the doctor one evening. "Spent my whole life being the cause of wounds, not healing them." The doctor had smiled knowingly. Redemption comes in strange forms out here. Up at his ranch, Morgan had returned to his quiet routine, though things had subtly changed. The townsfolk's whispers had a different tone now. Respect instead of suspicion, gratitude instead of fear. They'd seen what lay beneath the silence and they understood it better. Marshal Kane and the other judgment riders had departed as quietly as they had arrived, melting back into the territories like the ghosts they were. But Kane had left Morgan with a warning. "Word spreading, other outlaw gangs will hear about Blackridge. Some will be smart enough to stay away." "And the others?" Morgan had asked. "The others will come, testing the legend, looking to make their own names by challenging the ghost." Matthews, last to leave, had added his own counsel. "The wolf that hunts alone dies alone. Remember you have brothers, even in the shadows." Sheriff Cooper, before returning to his duties, had offered Morgan a badge. "Territory could use more men like you," he'd said. "Official capacity this time." Morgan had declined with a slight shake of his head. Some ghosts serve better in the shadows. Doc Henry, tending to the last of the wounded, had perhaps understood best. Men like Morgan, he told Burke quietly. "They're the price of civilization in a wild land. We sleep safe because they stand ready to do violence on our behalf. The real heroes are the ones who carry that burden quietly." The truth about Lost Valley had emerged gradually, pieced together from whispers and half-remembered tales. How young Deputy Morgan had been away that night tracking a horse thief. How he'd returned to find his world reduced to ashes, his mentor, their families, everyone he'd known. How something in him had died that night, only to be reborn as the ghost. One evening about a month after the shootout, Calvin Burke made one final visit to the ranch before heading east. He found Morgan on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The evening air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and somewhere in the distance a lone wolf howled. "The other riders send their regards," Burke said, settling into a chair. "Say they'll come if you ever need them again." Morgan nodded, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Some debts can never be repaid." "No," Burke agreed. "But some ghosts can find peace even if they can't find rest." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness crept over Eagle's Crossing. In town, lights began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing a home, a family, a piece of civilization carved out of the wilderness. "You know," Burke said finally, "been thinking about those old stories about how the ghost of Lost Valley died in Oklahoma." Did he? Maybe not. Maybe he just found something worth living for instead of dying for. As night settled over Eagle's Crossing, people slept easier knowing their guardian angel wore a black duster and carried a Colt walker. The legend of the ghost would live on, but the truth was both simpler and more profound. In a land where justice was often as elusive as morning mist, sometimes it took a ghost to remind people that consequences still existed for evil deeds. But peace in the territories was as fragile as morning frost. Already, word of the Black Ridge Gang's fall was spreading, drawing new predators like wolves to wounded prey. In saloons and camps across the frontier, men spoke in whispers of the ghost who destroyed the mighty Black Ridges, each telling making the legend grow. Some would stay away, warned by wisdom or fear. Others would come, drawn by the chance to make their own legends. The ghost of Lost Valley would ride again, and the silence of Eagle's Crossing would soon be broken by new thunder. Sarah Mitchell, organizing her store one evening, watched Morgan through the window as he rode past on his evening patrol. "He's different now," she told Martha Thompson. "Still quiet, still watching, but there's something else there." "Hope," Martha replied wisely. "Sometimes the best way to lay your ghosts to rest is to become someone else's guardian angel." At his ranch, Morgan had made subtle changes. The defensive positions remained, but now they protected more than just his property. Regular folks began to settle nearby, knowing that the shadow of the ghost's wings stretched far enough to shelter them too. Young Tom Wilson, growing into his badge, often rode patrol with Morgan now, learning the quiet ways of watching, waiting, protecting. "Town's changing," he observed one evening. "Growing stronger, like it finally found its backbone." Morgan's only response was a slight nod, but his eyes held a warmth that hadn't been there before. The truth that Eagle's Crossing had learned was simple but profound. Sometimes the most dangerous men aren't the ones who seek violence, but those who've learned to carry it like a burden, using it only when necessity demands. The quiet ones, who move like shadows and speak in whispers, they're the ones who truly understand the weight of life and death. Up next on your screen, you've got two more remarkable tales that'll keep you on the edge of your seat. If this story of the ghost of Lost Valley touched something in you, you won't want to miss these. Just click and prepare yourself for more legends of the American frontier. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You never know when another ghost might ride into view. For in the end, that's what Michael Morgan had become. Not just a legend, not just a ghost, but a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the frontier, justice could still be found. Sometimes you just had to listen for the silence that comes before the thunder. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.